Wonderful. The live stream seems to be connecting, so everything's good on the technical side so far. I wish you a wonderful webinar.
Thank you. We will wait for 1 more minute and then start. Hello. Can you hear me? I see only a screen.
Loud and clear.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, my name is Anubandh, and I welcome you to the EU-India People Summit. Today is the 3rd day of this summit. And in this summit so far, we had very interesting sessions. And among the sessions that we have planned during this week, we have the topics of identity and nations, human rights, digital democracy, business and trade, and a lot of other interesting topics. And you can check all these on the website. Why we are doing this summit? Because there's this official diplomatic summit between India and EU, which is going to happen on 8th of this month, 8th of May. But the summit is closed to civil society from India as well as from European Union. So the idea was to avail a platform to intellectuals, to social activists, so to parliamentarians, and to people to talk, discuss together. And for us, it's a festival of ideas. So today we have the session about the topic refugees and border securitization. And we have 4 guests with us. 2 are from India, 2 are from Europe. So we have Catherine Wihtol de Wenden. We have Marie-Caroline Saglio-Yatzimirsky. We have Ravi Nair as well as Ranabir Samaddar. Before we go into introductions, I would announce, especially to the audience, that they have the option to ask questions, and they can enter their questions into the Q&A option, which is on the screen at the bottom. And in general, we will have the speeches spanning around 1 hour, and then we will start taking questions. So before I hand it over to you for introductions, I remember one line from Amartya Sen, who is India's Nobel Prize winner economist, and in his book Identity and Violence, he has written that identity. I mean, sometimes people have very limited control over how their identity is perceived and interpreted by other people, And in the context of our today's topic, it's very relevant. And with the same spirit, I also let our panelists to introduce themselves and perhaps also tell us about their link with India or Europe, and maybe in 2-3 minutes. So I invite Catherine to go first.
Thank you. I am very pleased to be with you. So good morning in Europe and good afternoon in India. It is not my first EU-India experience, because I had the opportunity to meet some years ago Ranabir in the Indian program of the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme with Jean-Luc Racine, who was the head of the French Indian program, and other opportunities on the topics of Muslims in Europe with Rémi Levaux and also Jean-Luc Racine. So it is another opportunity to share with you some ideas. So I am a political scientist. I am Emerita Director of Research at CNRS. So it is the end of my career, and it was dedicated to immigration policies, refugee policy, migrant behaviors, and so on. And so I shall focus on two main topics. The first one will be on the changing image of the refugee in Europe now compared with the past, and also the new trends of refugee policies in Europe confronted with the European Commission and the populism in some European countries. About the image, I wanted to introduce this topic first by because I am preparing a book on the images of migrants and refugees for CNRS publisher. But the other reason, which is more important for this summit, is that we have had a very important historical change of the image on the refugees in Europe during these last 50 years. In the past, the refugees, which were not so welcome so well, if we are thinking about the Spanish Republicans, for example, arriving in France in 1939, the Armenians who arrived during the First World War, but refugees were rather had a rather positive stereotype in the public opinion, even if the public policy was not so generous, because the refugees were the symbol of the values of some European countries, most European countries like France, the human rights program, and the idea and the Convention of 1951 on refugees. So welcoming refugees was a moral obligation from the countries, and the image of the refugee was the image of freedom and Western values, and welcoming the refugee was also making politics in many European countries. During the Cold War, European countries, and mostly France, Sweden, and some others welcome refugees because, like the US and Canada, they wanted to show the good image of Western countries facing with communist countries, for example, in the welcoming of Vietnamians after the war of 1975. And we have had other experiences also fighting freedom after the Chilean civil war of 1973, for example. The Chileans were very well accepted. They were rather leftist people, while most of Vietnamians were considered as rightist people, ideas. But the image was freedom, refugee as a moral political obligation. Now it has very strongly changed because the refugees are considered as mixed flow. What are mixed flows? Mixed flows are people who are partly considered as economic migrants and partly people fleeing their country for ethnic, religious, or political reasons. So now it is very difficult to sort out, to make the distinction in many conflicts between the refugees and the economic migrants, even if most of them are considered as people belonging to the interpretation of the Geneva Convention of 1951. But we have seen during especially the so-called crisis of 2015, a kind of hierarchization between the people from Near East or Middle East, and some of them, like the Syrians, for example, got the refugee status in 90% of cases, especially in the beginning, while the sub-Saharan Africans have a lot of difficulties, even if they are fleeing from civil wars like Somalia, Eritrea, and so on, to get the refugee status because they are considered as people who are lying about their status. So there are good refugees and so-called false refugees. And the distinction between economic migrants and refugees is made in most of the minds. If we have a look on Australia, it is totally the contrary. In Australia, for example, the refugees are people who have to be evacuated in small islands around because they don't want refugees, but the economic migrant, which is selected, is very well welcome in this big country. So in Europe, there is a difference. But now in the words, in the vocabulary, we are speaking about refugees, while speaking about migrants. The term in order to define migration now is refugees. If you are speaking around in the streets, people who are speaking of refugees are speaking about migrants. So there is a lot of confusion in the stereotypes, and also the other trend is also the behaviors of some the borders to economic migration has been closed in 1973 for some countries, 1974 for France, and now it is the refugee pass is the only possibility to enter without any passport, without any visa, if at the border you say, I am asking for the refugee status. Most of them will not get the refugee status, but there is a trend because it is impossible for most of the newcomers who are not very qualified or who are not members of family reunification to enter legally in Europe. So there are some people who are trying the refugee application. So there is this confusion. There is a hierarchization in the image of the public opinion because there is a bad image of the sub-Saharan Africans and a good image of people from Near East and Middle East. And in the other problem in Europe is a very rare same answers given between European countries to the refugee applications. For example, first, Germany has welcomed most of the asylum seekers in Europe, not just in 2015, but since 1990s, for example, and also before. But the answers to the application are very different according to the various European countries, because each European country considers that they are leading politics in granting or not the refugee status. So it is the program, the idea to have a unified European answer to the refugee application is very difficult to reach, and in the European Pact for Asylum and Migration, which has been proposed by the European Commission in 2020, the question of unifying the refugee application is very difficult because each European country considers it is sovereign on granting or not the refugee status. Even if there are some convergences, there are a lot of divergences. For example, I had a look on some applications from some countries. For example, from Sri Lanka, France has been much more generous to Sri Lankans than Germany. I am not specialist at all of Sri Lanka. You are much better, but I don't know the reason. But we are also other discrepancies between many European countries of some profiles. So it is a problem, because also some European countries have interest in some other countries, and they don't want to be in conflict because they welcome or not refugees from these countries if they want to go on to have trade with those countries and so on. So in spite of the respect of the Geneva Convention, there are some politics which is introduced in the refugee management in Europe. And if we come back to this pact, which will be the program until these new years, because you are defining a roadmap, as you said, until 2025, I think that the pact will not change so much. Because now there is a populist trend in many European countries, which is very negative towards refugees. We saw the beginning of this lack of solidarity between Eastern and Western European countries during the crisis of 2015, the so-called countries of Visegrad, which is Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and now there is also Slovenia, which is also in this trend. We had during 2018 Italy also, with the extreme right in power, a very strong negative response to admitting refugees, and also the other lack of solidarity is between European countries of the center of the north and those of the south. In the geographical approach, now most of newcomers as refugees are at the border, at the southern borders of Europe, which is Greece, Cyprus, Malta, Italy, Spain, and they are receiving much more newcomers as people living in Poland, for example, or in Hungary. So there is this crisis of solidarity, because solidarity is a very important topic in Europe for human rights, because it is part of the European Constitution of Europe of the Lisbon Treaty of 2007. And the people, the countries which refused refugees have not been fined. Now perhaps they will pay for the repatriation in the new pact for those not admitted in Europe, but we don't know. Perhaps they will pay for camps in some other countries, not there, if you are in Hungary or Czech Republic, for example, or Poland. So there are a lot of questions which are not solved, and they will not be solved in the pact. And there is also a lack of trust between European countries and the European policy of the Commission. Some countries did not respect in 2015 and will not respect now the new trends of the pact, and perhaps there will need a lot of negotiation to have the acceptance of this pact at European level by the European Council, which is based on the unanimity of all the countries of Europe in order to implement the pact on European and asylum in the European system. First, preparation by the Commission, second, discussion of the Parliament without vote for this pact, and after acceptance by the Council, it is not accepted. And so there will need a lot of negotiation in this climate of populism in Europe. So there are, and the pact will not change a lot. The announce, well, we will put all on the table and we will change all, announced Mrs. van der Leyen. If we have a look at the pact, nothing is changed. The Dublin agreements, which have been very strongly criticized, will not be changed, because many countries are very pleased of this system if they are not at the doors, at the borders of the arrival of refugees. And perhaps there is an announcement of repatriation, but In fact, it is very difficult to repatriate, so it will not function. I think it is just for the public opinion. And the other trends as having more securitization of borders with a bigger budget for Frontex, and there have been a lot of mistakes which have been made by Frontex, but they will go on in a kind of past dependency towards the main policies laid before. For example, return policies don't work. Development as an alternative to migration is also announced, but it never worked really during these last 30 years. So I think we cannot wait a lot from this pact, except if there is a very strong negotiation with the European countries which are against the acceptance of refugees, which is dubious, and the only one measure which is positive, I think, is the idea to accept the NGOs which have big boats of rescue in the Mediterranean, which will have to be accepted in European harbors, and these NGOs will not be sanctioned for this welcome of refugees, which was not the reality in the past. But except for that, there is quite nothing. And the pact is named on immigration and asylum, but there are very few words on immigration. In fact, the only real reform of asylum would consist in reforming also migration. We cannot have a very effective asylum policy if we go on to close the borders to immigration of work. In the period before 1975, when borders were open to economic migrants, the refugees had the profiles of refugees because there existed other possibilities to enter legally in Europe for families, but also for workers. And so if we don't change the policy about freedom, selective freedom for immigration of work, we will not change really asylum, because there will be people who are between the profile of asylum seekers and the profile of workers, which make very difficult the selection between refugees and economic migrants. So it is the real problem, but we cannot imagine this reform, which would be very important, because the public opinion and the extending populism is against such a reform. So the governments are making especially immigration and asylum policy for the public opinion and not for a rational and efficient policy in our countries.
Thank you, Catherine. I think it was interesting, especially from an Indian point of view, to learn how the approach towards immigrants and migrants in Europe had changed over time, and how the preferences, the hierarchies also that you mentioned. Regarding the Sri Lankan preference to the Sri Lankan refugees in France, I think we can explore the reasons behind it. But it is also true that certain immigrants have preferences. For example, we know that many people who come to Europe, they want to go to UK, and then they pass through France and other countries. So thank you. I would next request Ranabir to please speak next. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yeah.
I am Ranabir Samaddar, and I work in a small research center in Calcutta, in Kolkata now called. And I work on issues of migration, forced migration. I'm happy to be invited. I meet my dear friend Ravi Nair, who is a friend of mine for a long time here, though virtually. as well as I'm meeting Catherine again. I do not know how many years, maybe more than a decade. We met last, and thank you, Catherine, for remembering me. The invitation is important also because this is, if you remember, the 70 years of the Refugee Convention. And the Refugee Convention is something, 1951 Convention. It is always a kind of an uneasy reminder of what do you do with the text. You cannot say throw it out. You cannot say that you abide by it and it will be a guide to the things that it is supposed to guide us. And that sense of unease, as well as the the understanding that it's an obsolete thing. At the same time, it always reminds you of certain things that were supposed to have been done in a different way. So all people do is that they cut up the body of the text in from right to left, left to right, from top to bottom, bottom to top. But nobody can say what to do with that. And so when I got the invitation, I thought that this is an important occasion. One, that it will remind us whatever I'm going to say in the next 10, 12 minutes of uh, the kind of the intractable nature of the history that we are left with. As I said, we do not know what to do with it. And one of that kind of intractable nature is the way in which relations between the once colonized countries and the colonial powers, how they stay with us for decades and for more than a century. And in that sense, the Refugee Convention is an incredibly innocent document, in the sense that uh, it seems it has no history, even though legal historians always, dig up things and say, oh, the convention was made in such and such historical circumstances. Fair enough. But at the same time, the text itself is an incredibly innocent document, as if there is no history, there is no colonialism, there is no war, and people are only fleeing due to violence or threat of violence, and countries imbued with the philanthropic awareness or sense of solidarity, they are waking up and giving protection. Now, if the world were, that philanthropic, then things would have been much easier. So one of these, as I say, the refugee convention, one of the things that it is innocent and by implication ignorant of is the inbuilt nature of the colonial relation in the global migration flows. Now, Catherine very correctly pointed out the question of the mixed flow, but if you look at the UNHCR papers in around 2009-10, it is not good to boast of one's own institution or one's own work, but the institution where I work, Calcutta Research Group, the refugee workshop, annual migration workshop that we do, we in fact, from 2001 and 2, we had been telling that the whole question of individual refugee status determination makes no sense, given that today's migrant flows are both mixed and massive. Part of the reason, again, as Catherine very correctly pointed out, is the whole question of labor migration. And therefore, the nature of the migration is mixed. Take the 19th century into account. Very briefly, if you think of the Chinese labor migration into United States, when the fabulous railway lines were built on the Sierra Nevada Valley or Canadian highlands, the way Chinese labor was inducted, imported, deployed in labor, or think of the entry of the Algerians, Moroccans, Italians in in cities of France. There is this fascinating book by this historian Clifford Rosenberg. I think the name of the book is Policing Paris, Immigration Practices in Pre-War Europe. And it actually stops around 1925, which shows that some of the actually great coastal cities of France, Spain, they were all done with. And even the urban management of Paris itself rested on a very solid basis of migration management. So in a way, it also takes us back to the Oriental histories of 17th, 18th century, how cities were managed, towns were managed on the basis of the quarters, as they would call quarters of Turkish labor, quarters of Palestinian labor, quarters of Uzbek labor, Caucasian labor, or Arab labor, etc., etc. So that past remains with us. There is something again in the 2015 migration crisis, which came out, European migration crisis, which came out very well, that hardly anybody was telling Europe that it is your own doing, and it is better that you own up the history that you had been a part of. Think of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, otherwise called the Asia Minor Agreement of 1916, a secret agreement between Britain and France, where they carved up Asia Minor, and which you can, the present Syrian war, you can draw a straight genealogy from the Asia Minor Agreement of 1916. And today, when you see the bombings in Afghanistan, in Syria and all that, you would at one level ask, where is the Refugee Convention? Hardly the 51 Convention mentions war. It is amazing, if you look at from the post-colonial point of view, that you are creating a document for protection of refugees, and two things almost you don't have. You don't have partition there, and you don't have war there. You have violence, but it is such a, in that sense, how would you put it, a non-specific thing, which is almost killing the specific nature of the post-colonial or colonial situations of war, plunder, aggrandizement, etc., that you have to think, then where does actually the refugee come from? Does the refugee figure, the figure of the refugee or the migrant, does she originate from some, 0 point? So I think if you look into the 2015 European crisis also, migration crisis, you'd have this point, which I'm trying to make, is that there is an inbuilt colonial and post-colonial element to the situation, where in brief, you can have two or three. One is that the migrations to Europe would be from the post-colonial world in mixed forms and massive forms, number one. Number two, that this also tells you that Europe is only the peninsula of a large continent called the Eurasian region. And therefore, what you have today is the population pressure from the eastern side, and certainly across what you may call the Mediterranean lake, from the southern side, huge demographic pressure on Europe. And frankly, there is no historical answer to this huge thing that has been accumulating. All you can see when you think of the Mediterranean and therefore the boat crossings and all that is, I would say that it's simply the tip of the iceberg. There is a massive tectonic shift in terms of population configuration from the eastern part and the southern part. And what else could be the better site of such population movements than the sea? And again, you can look at the colonial situation. Think of the Komagata-Maru incident of 1913-14 in India, where this ship traveled from the western shore of Canada and traveled all the way, shooed away, driven away from port to port, until it landed in Calcutta, bringing in the migrants who were stopped from landing and then killed on the streets and on the dock of Calcutta. This is a very famous incident, and Canadian post-colonial scholars, human rights scholars have done so much work. It reminds you so much of the Rohingya, the boat refugees today. It reminds you so much of the Mediterranean migration today. So sea as the terra incognita, as the perfect site of statelessness, where there is no other identity but the identity that she could have on it. All kinds of people, whether they're Sudanese, they're Moroccans, they're Turks, there are reports of Bangladeshis trying to enter Europe through Africa and via the Mediterranean, is something that tells you that the colonial legacy still remains. I think the two more, very briefly, just two more points that I want to add to this is that, again, if you see the 2015 European refugee crisis, but you can see also even among the most critical migration studies and refugee studies scholars, again, it's a very, how should I put it, a very, innocent kind of approach to the whole thing, that there is no historical dimensions to whatever Europe is or facing in 2015. I had actually written something, and which I was very happy because I have my Greek friends who took up the books, translated it in Greek, and had 2-3 rounds of discussions. It was called A Post-Colonial Inquiry into Europe's Date and Migration Crisis, where what I wanted to argue was that the date crisis of Greece and the migration crisis, the gate being Greece, how they were connected. Now, if you really look into things, take again, in the European migration crisis, nobody was speaking about thousands of trafficked women who are trafficked into Europe, and there are European studies which roughly put the figures from 60 to 80% of the victims of trafficking, or women or men who voluntarily joined the sex work in Europe, they all belong to the non-European countries. They are all victims of almost an animal-like immigration policy. They are all victims of all kinds of modes of state surveillance. And there was, in fact, an economic study published in The Economist that how much the internet has added or has facilitated the worldwide sex trade, again, in which the colonial and the post-colonial relations actually work very much. So even if you see, let's say, the care industry, again, you will see that labor migration, once you open up this whole question of migration to the problematic of labor, and if you see how refugees are also finally labor without identity, the stateless is actually most of the time precariat labor who have the perfect identity of being a part of the labor force, but no other identity, no nationality, no state, nothing. All they have to do is to survive, to run from place to place, exactly as indentured labor used to do in the last century. So I think I shall stop here. But all I want to say is that refugee studies scholars, migration studies scholars, for some reason, they stick so much to law, they stick so much to current, whatever is happening. But there is something called history. And once you open up the whole question of migration, how has this figure appeared and reappeared in the last 300 years in terms of global relations, in terms of, as I say, relations between the colonial powers and the colonized countries, and the way in which post-colonial relations are configuring themselves, I think it would be adding much more substance to the idea of the People's Summit, because finally, when you speak of the EU-India People's Summit, then how do you leave out the histories, the interconnected histories of the peoples of these two continents? One is a continent, the other is an almost continent-like land, India, but at the same time, it's also a part of what even 100 years was called Eurasia. So today, the idea that Europe, Asia, these are completely two different continents is again only 200 years old. It was part of a huge, huge land called the Eurasian landmass. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranabir. I really like the fact that you made the link that history should not be forgotten, or the background should not be forgotten when we talk about the immigrant conventions or laws. And it was intriguing when you said that the Geneva Convention was incredibly innocent. I would ask, do you think this retrospectively, or do you think it was right from the beginning. It was deliberately made to look as innocent. But well, we will have time to talk about it. Lastly, I also like the fact that you made the distinctions between the types of migrations, and you talked about the labor migration. For example, we don't hear much about Chinese labor migration to United States. We talk about Africans being taken, so I think that was something interesting. So thank you. Next would be Ravi Nair. If you could please start. Thank you.
Thank you, Anubandh. I hope all of you can hear me loud and clear. I've been working with refugees since 1971. I do not work with migrants. I mainly work only with civil and political refugees. I started my work with Iranian refugees who were fleeing the terrible oppressive regime of the then Shah of Iran, both Islamic refugees and leftist students belonging to all factions of the Iranian left. In the 80s, I branched on to working with Afghan refugees, mostly Hazara, Tajik, and a few Pashtun, and a few Uzbek. I then also in the 80s started working with Sri Lankan Tamil refugees, with whom I continue to work today. And I also know the government side quite well. I have worked with official European refugee agencies in Switzerland, Germany, the United Kingdom, Denmark, and have on occasion worked on individual cases with Sweden. I have also worked closely with the official body in Australia. I've done refugee determination process seminars for determination officers in Canada quite a few times. You should find them on their website. So I'm no stranger to European refugee norms and standards and their actual practice. I'm also very familiar with British NGOs and refugee lawyers working on refugee issues in Canada, the US, and the UK. And in the 90s worked fairly closely with ECRE, which I'm not sure whether it exists now because I stopped working on non-Asian issues in early 2000. Let me quickly come to the main topic. And I'll confine myself, and I have a huge shopping list, so I'll see if I can go as fast as possible. India always had a security perspective on refugees. It never had a humanitarian perspective. At least Europe started with some kind of a humanitarian perspective after the war. But since 2000, it has come full circle and is now using the security perspective that we adopted from day one. They had adopted the security perspective until the war, until the Second World War. But after the Second World War, I think ashamed by the discussions in the Commission on Human Rights being formed in 1945, they decided to go on for discussions, and then came the convention itself, which I shan't talk about now. But, let me come to partition, which Ranabir alluded to, where a large number of Muslim and Hindu populations exchanged between India and Pakistan. A lot of Muslim who were Indian but left during partition in 1947 and who were, had landed property or urban property or had stable professions in India wanted to come back because their experience of Pakistan did not suit them. And they started trickling back. And in Delhi alone, 20,000 of these people who had gone to Pakistan came back as refugees once again to their original country and sought to start lives. The Indian government was not only is not only Hindu fundamentalist now, it also had a soft Hindutva fundamentalist touch even at that point. So alarmed at the coming back of Muslims and the problems socially and politically that would ensue, they introduced a permit system for people coming through back from Pakistan. About 3,000 permits were issued up to August 1949, and subsequent to that, they turned into a trickle, and it's almost next to impossible to get a refugee permit to return to India since the after the 1965 India-Pakistan war. India also created refugees. Also from a security perspective. The Lisu, a small tribe in the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, whose largest population is in Yunnan province of China, and a few lesser population in Burma, in the upper reaches of Burma, have about 5,000 inhabitants in Arunachal Pradesh, especially in Changlang districts. When the first clashes between India and China started in what was then the Northeast Frontier Agency which is now called Arunachal Pradesh, the Lisu were forcibly moved out of their villages by the Indian army. Many of them trickled into Burma. Some stayed on, but in almost like an example of new strategic hamlets that the Americans invented in Vietnam and the British earlier invented in Malaya, now Malaysia, under the Templar security doctrine. Until the 80s, the Lisu were not given Indian citizenship. They were finally given Indian citizenship in 1994, and they, however, have not been given scheduled tribe status, which accords them certain self-governance rights, which the Indian government is very worried about, being on the Chinese border. Now, you look at the whole issue of how India has treated refugees subsequently. The recent abrogation of the special status of Kashmir by the Indian government also created problems because the large number of Muslim refugees had fled Jammu and Poonch and Rajouri in 1947 due to the pogroms initiated by the Hindu mobs against them. In 1982, the local state government in Kashmir adopted a law in the state assembly, elected state assembly, that they could come back, that they were eligible to come back at some point once the President of India ratified the assembly resolution. When the assembly resolution went to the President of India, he referred it to the Supreme Court of India for advice. The Supreme Court very intelligently sidestepped the issue and said that it was would not do it, and just sat on it for a few years, refusing to give an opinion. Then it was forced by a person very close to the Hindu point of view by filing a petition saying that it should be that the resolution should be struck down. The Supreme Court stayed the implementation of the Assembly resolution in 2002. So none of those who fled in 1947 or 48, apart from what I told you about mainland India, including in Kashmir, were allowed to come back. Now, let me take each parts of the border. The BSF the border security force is on the Indo-Bangladesh border presently. And they were given permission to take over the whole border as late as 2015. No, there was a discussion to give it permission up to 2015, but it was opposed by the army, which uses its paramilitary in the Indian sense of the word, not in the Latin American sense of the word or the European sense of the word. And it is now run by the Assam Rifles, though the border security force continues to lobby that it should take over. Now, the border security force does control only the Bengal-Bangladesh border. And if you look at the website of a small Indian NGO called Masum, M-A-S-U-M, you will get chapter on and verse on the horrible human rights violations being perpetrated on the people on the border, those trying to come in or go out there. There's very few refugees at the moment, but there are just mostly people living on border villages on both sides of the border, and the usual number of smugglers, crooks, traffickers, and that whole area. In fact, the most vivid scene was a photograph was of 2011, January, where a 15-year-old Bangladesh girl from a neighboring village was caught in a barbed wire and hung on the barbed wire for 3 days with her dead body after the BSF had shot her. It was only after the Bangladesh press went completely amok that the Indian BSF took down the body after a few days. But what is worrying now is that these border security forces are now being given police powers, civil police powers. These are paramilitary organizations. They are like the National Guard in the US. They are not ordinary precinct policemen. And here they are given civil police powers. This is incredible. Secondly, on the Bhutan and Nepal border, you have another funny creature which the Indian government has created, which is called the Special Security Bureau. It was created immediately after the First Indo-China War and trained by British counterinsurgency experts who had honed their skills in Malaya against the communist Chinese insurgency. And they have both a dual intelligence as well as a special commando remit and mandate. They have an act, but they come under the administrative control of the Intelligence Bureau of India, which is a completely illegal organization. There is no parliamentary act governing it, and it is not, its budget is not audited by the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, and it has no parliamentary oversight. They are a complete law unto themselves, but more on that later. Due process, procedure established by law, pushbacks, the bogey of security threats. This is what informs Indian refugee policy at the moment. They were terrible with the Sri Lankan Tamil refugees in the last days of the war in Sri Lanka in 2009. The Indian Navy, the Indian Coast Guard, and the Sri Lankan Coast Guard and Navy, acting in concert, created a cordon sanitaire where they did not allow any of the people in the Vani area who were ordinary civilians caught in the crossfire between the LTT and the Sri Lankan army to come and cross over to India. A lot of lives, many thousands of lives were lost. It was only because of the complete insensitivity of the Indian government acting in concert. Similarly, in Bhutan, I was one of the first people who entered in Bhutan when the crisis of the Nepali Hindu population were being evicted from Bhutan by the Bhutanese government was happening. And I had to plead with the refugees not to come into the talking to by Indian intelligence officials who tried to send them to Nepal. There is no common border between Nepal and Bhutan. There is no contiguous border between India and Nepal. But the Indians were very smart. They wanted to be Pontius Pilate and wash their hands of this problem. And they quietly supplied trucks, took them to the Nepalese border and dumped them into Nepal. And of course, the Nepalese government, being what it is, or what it was, a very weak government, did not dare to protest. Border fencing is a major problem. Border fencing is a major problem on the West Bengal side. It is a very major problem in Tripura. It is a very major problem in also in now happening in a big way on the Nepalese border. The Indians have also allowed refugees to die in sheer misery, not in terms of rations and other things, but a group of Bihari Muslim refugees, leftover of the 1971 Indo-Pakistan war on the eastern side, tried to cross into India, succeeded with the help of smugglers, finally got to, for some odd reason, somebody told them that they should go to the Kutch area and try to enter Pakistan through the Kutch area. The Kutch area is a barren piece of salty marshland, and the Pakistani rangers were a bunch of greedy gluttons. They wanted big money for each of the refugee families trying to cross over. So they pushed them back into India because these guys didn't have the money to pay these Pakistani rangers. The Indian Border Security Force pushed them back into Pakistan. There was a football match using the refugees as footballs for a few weeks, and the refugees all died of starvation in the run of Kutch. I tried to yell, mumble, and grumble, but then UNHCR in India is not the greatest organization in the world. I don't know how it is now in Europe. In India, we call it Universally Negligent, High-Handed Committee for Reform. So that says it all as far as I am concerned. I have a huge other shopping list, only to say that I better stop here and let you ask questions, but to say that refugee policy today in Europe is terrible. I withdrew from any cooperation with refugee organizations, official refugee organizations in Europe in the beginning of 2000. I continue to work with refugee lawyers in Europe, and because I could see the policy shifting, I could see and today I can only end by saluting those European NGOs who take great risk and pain to go into the Mediterranean and rescue people in the high seas in very difficult circumstances and great danger and bring them to safety. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ravi. That was fantastic. I like the fact that you made the distinction between the security perspective and the humanitarian perspective towards migrants or refugees. And you also mentioned about the soft Hindutva, which was there, even before the BJP government came into place. And lastly, for me, this was a revelation about the football match that you talked about between India and Pakistan and how the refugees were made to die. So I think there are a lot of things that we forget or we do not take into account. And I'm happy that we have this forum and today's discussion to bring these points forward. So our last guest now is Marie-Caroline Saglio-Yatzimirsky, and I request her to take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anubandh. I'm very happy to be with you today, and I'm most honored to be with this panel, and I think this summit is very important. following the three presentations, I will talk about a very micro social anthropological point of view. I'm a social anthropologist. I'm working at the Institute of Oriental Studies in Paris. I'm also clinician psychologist at the Avicenne Hospital in the Paris suburbs, working with refugees. And I'm meeting there a lot of Tamil from Sri Lanka, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis. So I will talk about these very recent trends of South Asian asylum seekers in France. And I would say before starting that the continuous flow of news makes this topic very difficult to tackle, almost impossible, I would say. Furthermore, since 2020, we look at all these events through the lenses of the current sanitary crisis, which twists the true picture, I think, also. Let's address our issue, the South Asian exiles in France for the last 5 years. I shall first examine the recent data on South Asian migration in France and what they tell in the context of this asylum crisis, which is for sure a crisis of European reception, as Catherine told us. Since till 2015, there is significant arrival of asylum seekers on European territory. I will exclude the case of Afghans, which have become by far the biggest group of asylum seekers in France for several years. I'm particularly interested in 4 countries whose number of nationals with asylum application have recently increased, that is Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, as far as there is the appearance of an Indian question since 2019. From the outset, let us remember that all these migrations have been present in France since the 1970s. They are old migration, we could say, but recently they have increased and they have changed in nature. Whereas it was more informal network and economic migration, now we see more and more migrants arriving through the asylum application as refugee. And I said also there is this question of an Indian question, just very new question. So I will use the OFPRA statistics. OFPRA stands for us as the French Office for the Protection of Refugees and Stateless Persons. This is the institution which is dealing with asylum law in France. So if we use OFPRA statistics, we can see a certain number of things. In 2019, there were about 120,000 applications and decisions rendered by the OFPRA. If we examine then these applications through the Geneva Convention, and this definition of fear of being persecuted, then we can see Bangladesh is in the top 10 sources countries for the nationality of applicants, ranking the 5th country in 2019 for application, with a significant increase. It's about 6,000 applications per year now. The reason for the Bangladeshi application changed little from year to year. Political commitment, mostly with opposition parties based on activist commitment like trade union leaders, journalists, bloggers, are the major reason to migrate, to ask for asylum. Belonging to religious minority also, like mostly Hindu in Bangladesh, is also frequently cited as a reason to ask for asylum. In addition to these reasons, you have many intra-family problems such as land disputes, marriage, thwarted relationships, and sometimes also gender-related issues like sexual orientation. But to summarize, as far as Bangladesh is concerned, we see always the same patterns, which is affiliation to a political network, let it be Bangladesh Nationalist Party or Awami League, depending on the party in power, and adverse cronyism and local corruption, like the major reasons to trigger decision of migration. As for Pakistan, Mariam Abu Zahab, who is the late specialist on this issue, wrote in 2007 that Pakistani immigration to France was part of a classic change migration pattern, from a default destination, as far as France is not Great Britain. France represents for these migrants the possibility of accessing a living standard of Pakistani middle class, thanks to a family network and close links maintained with the region of origin. This has changed a lot. Asylum requests today from Pakistan have been growing for several years, and they doubled from 2017 to 2019, for example. We have today more than 3,050 applications per year. So there are some correlation, direct correlation with political events. For example, the claim related to the separatist provinces in Pakistan, the question of Kashmir, the applicants also from the former Pakistani tribal areas that were merged in 2018 with the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And then there are all the political changes in the country, the very recent changes. But politics is not the primary reason for application, as the question of thwarted union, land dispute, seems to be preponderant. That is what say the OFPRA. Another major reason for requesting information is gender and religious minority issues. I'm talking here about Ahmadis, Shia, Christians. Let's come to the Tamil from Sri Lanka, which is outnumbering other South Asian communities in France, with a population of about, it's estimated at 150,000 in France. Most of these Tamil people came from this Jaffna Peninsula and the east of the island, as Ravi Nair told about us. Their migration is old. It started in the 70s with the conflict, of course. Asylum applications are still present, if of course they decreased since 2009, and the signing between the Sri Lankan Armed Force and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Area Organization, but still there is a permanent demand correlated to the political events in the country. And the major reason for demands is always the support to the Tamil cause, as well as the family ties with the Tamil Ilam organization. In 2016, there were about 1,000 applications per year. And today, since 2018 and 2019, there are rather 2,000 applications per year. I would add that the Eastern attacks in 2019 against the country's Christian community which was claimed by a local jihadist organization and the Islamic State organization, have resulted in an increased scrutiny and political violence. And since these events, we can see more Muslim community from Sri Lanka coming. And they cite religious reason for being subjected to violence by Buddhist extremism. As I told in my introduction, the very recent statistics of OFPRA have seen India for the first time since years. Let us remember that India is considered as a country of safe origin by the Asylum Administration of France. In 2019, the administration studied about 500 applications from Indian people. What is making the buzz in France today is the issue regarding the issue of Indian migrants is the announcement last week of 87 Indians in the irregular situation being in the waiting area for pending person, a closed center where migrants are kept at the Roissy airport in Paris. In this retention zone, there are no more generally than 150 people that can be that can stay there. And today there is these 87 people among 120 exiles that are retained there. It seems a very low number, but the ratio of Indian is very high. So the OFPRA view is regarding those Indian applicants that most of them invoke private conflicts like land dispute, conflicting unions, with the background of religious and caste difference. and that very, very few of the applications are politically motivated. These requests for asylum are sometimes marked by specific regional context. I will talk about, I'm thinking about the inhabitants of Tamil Nadu who invoked fears based on support from the about the Tamil issue. But anyway, that is to be said that in 2019, we have seen the emergence of few applications from India, but very few regarding what could be the number of applications. There is a little correlation between these numbers and the current violent political background in India. I'm thinking especially about the Muslim religious violence in India today. And the research department of WOFPRA has been proposing an analysis of the Muslim persecution in India, which is available on internet. But there are very, very few applications from Indian people regarding these violences, and few applications also regarding the censorship, persecution on academics, journalists, etc. In my second part I will quickly come back a little more on what figures do not say, and for that I can use the perspective of anthropology and psychology as far as we are meeting directly in this consultation, in hospital consultation in psychotrauma, a lot of refugees from Tamils from Sri Lanka, Bangladeshis and Pakistani. They are very, very numerous. Some of them have arrived in France for a few years, but some have arrived very recently. They all express post-traumatic stress disorder due to violence. Violence can be threat, torture, imprisonment, rape, and their troubles are worsened by their being cut off from their country of origin and by the exile itself. Let me talk to you about these narratives of violence. We speak here on traumatic violence, intentionally man-made violence. This violence is less the traumatic event itself, that is the event itself, than the continuous impact on the psyche after the event. And the trauma, etymologically, trauma signifies wounds. And this trauma refers to the psychological trace caused by the break-in and is manifested by the mortifying repetition, which has buried the subject capacity to think and his possibilities to exchange with others. Now we witness a second trauma regarding these South Asian refugees. The second trauma comes from a new impossible challenge for them here. These very recent migrants claiming for asylum are asked to talk about the unspeakable if they want to pass the hearing set up by French administration and the OFPRA and at the National Court for Asylum Seeker. Part of the violence, indeed, is that the word themselves, the speech of the asylum seeker, is not anymore the basis for a trustworthy relationship, but become a weapon directly at them in many aspects. It starts in the homeland where the violence occurred, with insult and threat on top of the physical violence. It continues along the way with smugglers. And I would say that finally, in France, some asylum seekers have the feeling that it happens again, because telling a story that can be both painful and humiliating when you come from places and culture where you should silence the violence. I'm thinking of rape, I'm thinking of abuse. The speech is also very belittled as long as they do not offer sufficient proofs that they are real refugees. And I'm thinking here about Catherine saying that there are good refugees and bad refugees. So this speech is very difficult. As we noticed previously, traumatic violence is very often related to political violence, launched by the state or by militia or other unofficial local groups backed by the political forces. So once they arrive in France, this asylum seeker encounter another kind of country France, a rich country with the social protection very unknown. It makes it difficult for them to adapt and to navigate sometimes through the demands of the French administration. And here I think there is a dialectic to be understood at an anthropological and cultural level. These asylum seekers arrive from countries where community networks and family and groups solidarities are important and where state is crumbling sometimes. They arrive in a territory known as the host territory, France, where there is a social protection network, and this social protection took the role of community networks, and even more every networks based on community belonging in France is suspicious. So these are matters for misunderstanding which have repercussions on the way to settle in host territory. So to conclude, I would say on this very, very recent migration from South Asian to France, and especially on the figures related to these migration, I would say that the official figures of OFPRA and of the administration cannot tell us very much about the future trends of these asylum seekers group. There could be many hypotheses that could mark these future trends. Of course, these figures, these migration are part of an old Asian transnational and diasporic bridging, but they are also very much linked with political violence occurring in South Asia today, I think. Some are reshaping communitarianism and communitarian bonding through political domain, but some are more likely to follow social cultural adaptation of the general economic migration. It is also a question of generation, of course. What is certain is that beyond the statistical data, anthropological research and perhaps also psychological research allows for better understanding what is at stake in this migration. And this is very little developed and studied in France, but I think it could be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Caroline. I think that was great because I like the statistical and approach and figures that you cited regarding the preferences and about the migrants who come to France. And even the second point about psychological health. I think we often get into a talk and discussion about the basic material needs of the migrants, and this aspect is sidelined. And you also mentioned about the difficulty for the migrants to deal with the French administration. So I think that's a difficulty even for the many French people, so I can understand. And now I think we have 30 more minutes, and I know Ranabir has to go. But I propose we already have a lot of questions from the audience. I wanted to ask you and start with 4 questions. They are to each one of you, but directed. But you can choose which one you want to respond to. And maybe I cite them, I spell them out, and then one by one you can start to respond. And perhaps we will ask Ranabir to start first. But I take the thread from Marie-Caroline, and so I heard someone saying that we cannot really have peace in the world unless we stop beating our children, which is very basic thing, because the violence which is then internalized, and the power equations also. And when you grow and become an adult, just with your intellectual, you cannot often deal with it, and it manifests itself. My question is, in countries like India, Africa, and other countries where we do not have this official setup of psychological health, even in companies, big companies in India, I don't find it. But in France, you have it in public sector, also in private sector companies as well. You see that setup. My question is, what happens to these people, these societies where such help is non-existent? How do we see those societies evolving and the communities evolving? So that was to you. for Ranabir, I have a question which is a bit specific about this fascination about building walls. For example, India has this huge wall with Bangladesh. The border is of around 4,000 kilometers, 2,000 almost on West Bengal side and the other on his states. And I was surprised to know that it was started, the construction in 1992. It was really supported by the NDA BJP government in 1998. And the wall is 2-layered of barbed wires, and you have 2.5 meters height, and there is 150 meters of space, which is no man's land. And there are a lot of interesting stories also and tragedies also happening in that part. We also have the Berlin Wall, and I learned that initially there were a lot of, since the wall was running from the middle of the city, and there were patrolling and conflicts. So people left those parts and went to other sides of the city. And then people from Turkish origin, they came and squatted and took those places. But when the wall broke, the lands in the central city were with the Turkish people, for example. So in general about the question about walls, and we also know the Trump's fascination with the Mexican wall. Then I have a question for Catherine. So you talked about how migrants are seen, how stereotypes work, but I also want to bring in the fact that when we have foreigners, when we have people who are unknown, sometimes and often we have fear, but we also have some curiosity. We are curious to know about the unknown, the foreigner person. So how these two tendencies work together, and also in a world which is post-COVID now, where people-to-people contacts are not so easy to come. How do you see this equation between fear and curiosity working? And then lastly, I have for Ravi Nair, I have a question. If you can give us some history about how this concept of passports and visas came, and how it evolved during different world wars, before the war, during and after. For example, I know 30% of population in Sweden has immigrant roots. So we also have such examples where countries have been very generous and they have been very restrictive. And I think passports and visas are quite critical. I would love to be in a space where in the whole world, we don't need these restrictions. And I think Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, he tried to bring free circulation movement as a basic fundamental human rights. So yes, now it's open to you, and I request Ranabir to first to go first. Yeah, thanks.
See, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Now, on the question of wall, two things. First of all, wall is related to, it's a global thing. And you mentioned the India-Bangladesh thing. There is a study which shows that in the first 2 decades of this century, 64 countries erected wall or started erecting wall. Of course, the famous is the Trump wall, but 4 countries of Eastern Europe. And then not to forget the wall in the West Bank area, Israeli, walling off the Palestinians. What is interesting is that this is something which the refugee and the migration management techniques have inherited from medieval town management. And as you know, if you go to any old city like Delhi or Agra, or you were mentioning, if you go to Nicosia, for example, there is this old Venetian wall. You have the partitioning wall on the between the Greek side of Cyprus and the Turkish side of Cyprus. And ideally, there would be two walls. One is, of course, walling the entire city with gates, monitoring the trade, because up to the early modern age, trade was impossible without the trade outposts. So you had the walls. And then you have, of course, the wall which then guards the royal place or the ruler's place from which the ruler rules. And in some ways, if you look into the logistics of wall making, there is this book by, Wall Democracies, How Democracies Survive by Erecting Walls. Then you look at the logistics of wall setting up, you have therefore all the flexible techniques that are now combined with the essential principles of fortifying yourself. So frontier Europe is also a strategy of, putting in wall. And again, this has colonial roots in the modern case. As I said that although in the medieval times, this was part of military management, and it is from the, I'm reminded of Foucault, who had said that much of the civilian governance actually inherits from the military mode of, operating. But if we leave that aside, I think what is interesting is that if you look at the colonial policy would actually transform the walling strategy into kind of a frontier management, where frontier replaces the border as a very hard boundary line. And if you look into the history of the northeast of India, then you will see that frontier tract was actually the British policy to manage the eastern side of the British Empire in India. So the frontier gives you a stretch. Therefore, frontier gives you this whole, room to maneuver and room to negotiate with, where you can have your trade, you can have an expansive thing. And again, you can see Europe has taken it over. And coming back to the focus of today's discussion, that how Europe actually combines a border management, which is, let us say, the fortress Europe kind of thing, with a frontier management where the frontier actually extends beyond the Mediterranean into the African cities of Africa. So frontier is therefore always an area which is an expanded area, where therefore the metropolitan countries, the powerful countries, the colonial countries used to, keep it as a kind of zone, and then you would have the borders. So the fencing that you were referring to in the India-Bangladesh case is again something, if you visit the Palestine, Israel-Palestine thing, in many cases it is fenced, in most of the cases it is now walled. So fencing again is something that you find in many countries, and therefore borders, walls, fences, and frontiers, these are now combined into a range of, how would you place it, flexi-rigid kind of apparatuses through which you manage the whole thing. Classic would be again the airport. There is in fact very fine studies on how modern airports are created and how modern airports have the whole security dimension inbuilt in the making of it, where you know that you can have the so-called free countries from which people can come with free movement, the other countries from which you have a different kind of immigration system, but all within this complex called the airport. So the airport looks like a camp. The camp looks like a city. The city increasingly now looks like a camp. So all those things that you had in the mid-20th century, classic liberal concepts, as if cities are places of rights, camps are places of restrictions, etc., walls, borders. Now, as globalization and neoliberalism proceeds, you can see these fine distinctions between different apparatuses. They are now turned into what you might call a complex of flexible techniques with which migration and refugee management would be done.
Thank you. Who would like to go next? Catherine, would you like? Yeah, please. You're still on mute. You will have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. So I tried to reply to the question, which is a mix of fear and curiosity. I could say fear and desirability of migrants in Europe. Europe, as I wrote many times, is not a continent. It is a continent of immigration, but it does not accept this reality. So there is some illegitimacy of migration in the minds of many Europeans, because Europe went abroad for many centuries, and now it discovers it has been a very important immigration continent. So fear, because the topic, especially about the competition, the economic competition between migrants and workers, is a very old topic. For my next book, I studied this topic, which was present in the second part of the 19th century. And there has been some murders about this supposed competition between foreigners and workers. So it was very present in the discourse of the working class and even in some trade unions. And so now it is used by populist people. The idea that it was used by Jean-Marie Le Pen in the past, 3 million foreigners, 3 million unemployed French. So why would not we have better send back the 3 million foreigners in order to give their work to the French? It is false economically, because there is a strong stratification of the labor market in European countries, and the migrants, especially the newcomers, don't take the job which are required by the unemployed ones. But in the mind, it is very important. There is also the fear of terrorism. During the crisis of 2015, the discourse was, if we open the borders to the asylum seekers, we will open the borders to possible terrorists. If we have a look at the figures, yes, it is a very important question, terrorism, but it is not linked with welcoming refugees. We welcome 1.2 million asylum seekers in 2015 in European countries, and so only 2 of them practiced terrorist attacks in the same year in Nice and Berlin. So it is rare, even if it is very important. So the discourse saying, if you open the borders to refugees, you will open the borders to terrorists, is very present in the discourse, even if most of terrorists are people who got the citizenship of most European countries and who became terrorists with especially internet rapidly, and became rapidly terrorist people. But they had a very soft link with the practice of Islam before, and so there is no real link between migration flows and terrorism. Most terrorists are people having a solid status as long-term residents or as new nationals of European countries, second generations, and so on. So, but also there is desirability of migrants, because we are in a kind of discourse, as I told, which is made for the public opinion. So during the COVID crisis, we saw that the dream of populist parties was applied, because we closed the borders, and we saw that closing the borders was not a real answer to the immigration question, because there were shortages of labor force in Germany for picking some vegetable, or in France picking the fruit and flowers in the southeast of France and so on, and in Spain for picking the strawberries, for example. So there is a lack of labor force. In some Eastern Europe, we saw that closing the borders with neighbors, especially Romania, Ukraine, provoked a shortage of care workers, especially for old people in these countries, which are dreaming for homogeneity of the population. Now, in some European countries, there is a dream of a homogeneous population. And so there is a dream of people without any difference. And the idea that newcomers will bring differences is difficultly shared, even if in the past homogeneous countries did not made a lot, because many progresses in art, in science, were brought by people who had other eyes on their society, like in the US, like in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like in Russia, like in Ottoman Empire. And the diversity brought a lot about the progress in discovery, in culture, in sciences, in many, many disciplines. But it is very difficultly accepted by the population. And now in some European countries, and especially in the extreme rightist political parties, diversity is very difficultly accepted, because there is a dream of the roots, the ideas of, according to which those who have national roots are better nationals than others who would have no roots in the country where they are living. So it is a very dangerous definition of the nation states, the very dangerous definition of people inside these states, but it explains the mix of desirability and fear of newcomers.
Thank you very much. So Ravi, please, next is your turn. You're still muted. Yeah. Just a small, yeah, we still can't hear you. It's muted. Yeah, now we can hear you.
Now you can hear me.
Right, so we have around, brief. Sorry, yeah, we have around 10 more minutes. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I will first answer the specific question addressed to me, or what is the policy and program recommendation of refugees to EU and India. It's like asking me to write a PhD thesis in 5 minutes. But I'll tell you that basically the protection mandate of the UNHCR has been gutted by UNHCR itself at the request and prodding of both European and non-European countries. And I'll give you only one example, where that every regional bureau in the UNHCR until the late 90s had a legal officer to look at all policy issues. That was discontinued in the early 2000s. And so there was no legal oversight in the regional bureaus, whether they be Africa, Asia, Latin America, or Europe, which gutted refugee protection. In fact, one of the doyens of refugee academics, Guy Goodwin Gill, at that point of time didn't want to come out in public, but was very concerned, though he was chairperson of the Academic Advisory Council of UNHCR, brought out a report anonymously called the Protection Report You Will Not See, which is now, of course, published as a document under his name by the Oxford Refugee and Migration Studies folks. So basically, protection both nationally and internationally, has to be brought back on the agenda. The present Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, when he was head of the UNHCR, tried to do something about it and tried to bring something about it. But once he left for a higher job, I don't think the UNHCR was very keen on implementing some of the reforms that he put across. And this is across the world, it's not just India specific. So it's a very big battle. One quick complementary point to what Ranabir said about walls. Walls don't work anywhere in the world. Otherwise, Joshua in the Old Testament would not have to blow his trumpets and the walls of Jericho would have just fell down. It would have required at least siege engines. So just trumpets by Joshua in the Old Testament worked. But the Indian civilization approach was much more sensible. India never built walls. The Indian civilization did not build walls. Walls in Rajasthan and central India were a post after the Central Asian countries came to India and the Mughal rule started. Before that, we didn't have walls. We didn't even have city walls. Especially in southern India, we didn't have city. They came in with the Mughal and prior to that, the slave king dynasty. But Indians never built a wall. They always had a civilizational concept, which somebody should do research on, is that we will accept you. We don't need a wall. You are Arab, you're Scythian, you're Bactrian, you're Greek, you're Afghan, you're whatever you are, we will accept you. 200 years down the line, you will be us, we will not be you. Saying that we are the boa constrictor, we will swallow you and assimilate you. So much that your individual identities no longer exist. Which is true of India. Most of India's cuisine, North Indian classical music, without this influx of people from other climes, would be very different from what it is today. So let me make that point too. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Marie Caroline, please.
Yes, just to answer your question, if I understood. First, I would not say that there is no such psychological network or therapeutical network in India and in South Asia. There are a lot of kind of network, but they are different from the psychiatric biomedical network we do have in Western world. I would just say that your question is much bigger than. Is a very big question. This is the question of how far there can be historic trauma, and what is the question of memory for a population who've been harmed and who had faced a lot of violence in the country. And I guess these are kind of collective trauma, but we cannot address them very easily. I would also say another point. When you look at the people who are coming, the asylum seekers who are coming today, and when you look at the general migrants from South Asia who are coming today, may they be Tamil from Sri Lanka, may they be Pakistani and all, there are some very big differences between people. You have a young generation who is absolutely not, who doesn't want to endorse the war and the traumatic violence their father or parents have been endorsing, as a matter of fact. So I mean, every family, every case is I would say individual. In Western world, we are very we have a lot of medical and care tools to address this kind of trauma, but I think the question is more is very different to address, whether it's looking about individual question or a more collective traumatic question. This is my point.
Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we don't have much time. That's always the problem. So I'm not sure we can cover all the questions, but at least I will read them out, and you will get perhaps 1 minute to close with your closing comments, and if you can include an answer. So the question that I have, first one is that it's by Vijay Raghavan, and he says how the civil society organization movements and advocacy work towards the rights of these refugees, national governments in light with Geneva Convention and other international instruments. Then we also have why can't be crimes against refugees are crimes against humanity? Has there been any coercive action against any member state of UN for crimes against refugees? It's by Sarathi VP. Then we have a question related to Paris and France. So thank you so much to the panelists for this rich talk. And in Paris, a few years ago, it was so shocking to see that the public toilets have been intentionally closed, and I quote, to prevent the migrants to settle there. And then I have thought that we had reached the top of absurdity and inhumanity. In your opinion, nowadays, what political party in France and on Europe would offer the best or the less worse welcome to those helpless migrants? And yeah, I think these are the questions. So I request all of you to give your closing lines, and then we will conclude. So maybe Ranabir first, since you
one line comment from the taking off from the last observation. You see, race has been an inbuilt factor in colonial relations. The colonial relations were built on, as one says, the principle of difference, not the principle of identity. So race was always, and without race, you can't think of refugee question. In as much as today people say that the gender aspect of the refugee question is something which, unless taken into account, cannot be, you can't have. Similarly, the typical declaration on the public toilet reminds you of many such, prohibitions that used to be put on restaurant doors and etc. So race is always there. It's only shocking at times because it suddenly, your eyes stuck certain things. But on the other hand, any deep refugee study would tell you that without taking into account the fault line of race, you cannot understand how discrimination is actually, practiced in protective policies. And race is not only simply adopted as a principle of organizing society in the 18th and 19th century biological sense of the term, but cultural essentialisms are now reduced to quote and unquote physical and material differences between communities, which then become race. And therefore you have this famous saying that you may not have racism, but you will still have race. I mean, you know that Etienne Balibar had written of racism without race. But in one discussion, I said that we should be even more critical into seeing how things are developing and see that officially Europe and learning from Europe, India, we have all done away with ideology of racism. But we all racist in our nature, and we practice, follow racist practices. Thank you. I mean, I think I have to leave, so it's just my whatever little. And thanks.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. Catherine, please, if you would like. You have to unmute yourself. We can't hear you. Yeah. So Catherine, Ravi, and then Marika.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to ask to the questions of the audience. So about the role of NGOs, it is very important in the public debate in European countries, and most of the NGOs have networks, and they are very strongly organized to have a voice in the debate on migration and refugees, even if they are fighting very strongly for most of them against public policy, European policy, national policy and so on. In some cases, there are activists who were fined by their countries in Europe to have welcomed refugees and migrants, illegal migrants. I take the example first of Italy. In the city of Riace, in the south of the country, a mayor gave small jobs to illegal people in the cooperatives he created in his city, and he was fined and prohibited to still live in his own city he was managing. So it is an example. Another, in France, we have many, was the example of a farmer, Cédric Héroux, now very welcome in some associations, but also well known in France because he welcomed people trying to cross the Alps, mostly Africans, but so some Asians, from Italy to France. And so he was condemned by the French tribunals, and finally the Constitutional Council decided to free him from this condemnation, saying he was acting in respecting the notion of fraternity, which is registered in our definition of the social contract, freedom, equality, freedom, and fraternity. So the principle of fraternity was recognized by the Constitutional Council. In the region of also of Briançon, crossing the Alps, people were condemned for 6 months of prison to have helped people also crossing the mountains. But there are also welcoming cities organized in association of cities which welcome migrants, which is named Anvita, all over Europe, including Palermo. The mayor is stressing on the cosmopolitic tradition of his city in Sicily, but also Barcelona, for example, Strasbourg in France, and some others. And there are a lot of city networks which try to react to the national trend of policies, and also to the European very securitizing trend of their policy. So the local level is not necessarily at the same degree of closure as the national or the European one.
Yes, thank you. Ravi, would you like to go next?
Just quickly to answer your question, India introduced passports in 1922. And until the mid-70s, Indians did not need a visa to go to the UK because we were a Commonwealth country at that point of time, and you had leave to enter the UK for 3 months without an official visa. You could just land up at the airport and get entry for 3 months. The US was much more sensible. In fact, I think the most sensible country. Until 1941, they didn't have passports, period. And until 1978, you did not require a passport to leave or re-enter the country. Any identification was inadequate. So it was very, very sensible policy. I'm not aware of what happened in Europe. One other point I would like to make is that the most sensible migrant policy anywhere in the world was proposed by President Bush Jr., not the senior one, the junior one. But both Obama and Trump and the present guy will not look at it because Junior Trump knew what Mexican labor did on his own ranch and across the American Midwest. He said that let them all be regularized. Let's give them all work permits. Let them all enter and leave the country back to Central America or Mexico. Let them send their money and back and forth. so that they won't need the necessity of settling down here. Because you make them illegal, they want to settle. But if there is ability to come and go, send their money legally through legal channels and receive money legal channels, and pay income tax here, we will to a large extent mitigate the problem of illegal migration. And it's very, very true. Italy, France, Belgium's rural economies, the wine industry particularly, would all collapse if it wasn't for immigrant labor. I know for a fact that in Belgium there's huge private vineyards manned by particular villages from the Punjab. Without them, they would collapse. Similarly in Italy. So I think there has to be a sensible migration discussion in Europe. It's now Schengen, Fortress Europe.
Yeah, thank you very much. Marie-Caroline, you would conclude.
Yeah, I will conclude after what Catherine and Ranabir and Ravi said. I agree very much with what Catherine said, that local solidarities can be very different from what we see at a national level. And there are some kinds of local solidarities. And I would say also, when Ravi said that the question of refugee is for India a political perspective and not a humanitarian perspective, I would say exactly the same thing. Migration in Europe is today a political issue. It's not a humanitarian issue. And more than just a political issue, it's an election issue every day. So this is the sad part. But as we said, there are also some local solidarities. There are some local humanitarian experiences, a lot. And I would also say something is that we are in a very, very strange period right now. I think if really there is a baby burst, if there is a baby slump because of the COVID situation, who knows that this whole trend of barriers and frontiers in Europe will not change.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists, to the audience, to the organizers. When I look at the last 2 hours that we discussed, it was a festival of ideas and exchanges. And that's precisely the purpose of this summit. And I'm very happy you participated. And I hope we will have more such sessions. And so please stay connected, stay healthy, and see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
Consultation.